Mark Carney didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. When the former Bank of England governor and Goldman Sachs executive sat across from Donald Trump in what sources describe as a tense private meeting just weeks before Canada's federal election, he delivered a message that would ripple through diplomatic channels on both sides of the border. Enough is enough. The words were quiet. The implication was nuclear. And what happened in the 72 hours after that conversation has become the subject of intense speculation, leaked correspondence, and a brewing crisis that most Americans still don't fully understand. This isn't about trade tariffs or softwood lumber disputes. This is about what happens when economic warfare gets personal. When a man positioning himself as Canada's next prime minister decides to draw a line in the sand against the most powerful office on earth. And when that decision coincides with a series of market movements, diplomatic freezes, and whispered threats that suggest we're watching something far bigger than a bilateral spat. Because 3 days after Carney's private rebuke, Trump announced a sweeping review of North American defense commitments. 2 days after that, Canadian pension funds began quietly divesting from certain American infrastructure projects. And within a week, anonymous sources inside the Treasury Department were telling reporters that coordination on shared financial intelligence had gone unusually silent. Let's rewind. Mark Carney is not a typical politician. He's the man who steered Britain through Brexit's early economic chaos, who ran Canada's central bank during the 2008 financial crisis without a single bank failure, who speaks the language of markets and power with native fluency. When he announced his intention to seek the Liberal Party leadership and potentially become prime minister, it wasn't framed as a campaign. It was framed as a rescue mission. Canada, he argued, needed someone who understood how the global economy actually works, someone who could stand toe-to-toe with figures like Trump, not through bluster, but through cold strategic calculation. His pitch was competence as patriotism. His warning was that Canada faced existential threats it wasn't prepared to handle. Trump, by all accounts, viewed Carney's rise with suspicion bordering on contempt. Here was a globalist who'd worked for international institutions, a man who'd regulated banks rather than built them, someone who represented everything Trump campaigned against. But there was something else. Trump respects money and he respects leverage, and Carney had both. The meeting was supposedly arranged through back channels, framed as a courtesy call between potential future counterparts. What actually happened inside that room remains partially classified, but 3 separate sources with knowledge of the conversation have provided overlapping accounts. Carney opened with economics. He presented Trump with a detailed analysis of how proposed American tariffs on Canadian goods would ripple through supply chains, hitting American manufacturers within weeks, driving up costs for American consumers within months. He didn't plead. He didn't threaten. He laid out the math. Trump, according to one source, responded by suggesting Canada had grown too comfortable relying on American markets, that perhaps it was time for a rebalancing. That's when Carney's tone shifted. Enough is enough, he said, not as a threat, as a statement of fact. Canada, he explained, had spent decades as America's most reliable ally, its closest trading partner, its partner in continental defense. Canadian troops had fought in Afghanistan. Canadian resources had powered American industry. Canadian intelligence had been shared without hesitation. And in return, Canada was being treated like a strategic afterthought, a negotiating chip in whatever broader game Trump was playing with China or Europe or his own domestic base. The friendship, Carney suggested, had become one-sided to the point of exploitation, and that was going to change. Trump's response, leaked by someone in the room, was brief. We'll see about that. What happened next is where this story gets complicated, because it involves actions that can't be directly attributed, market movements that could be coincidental, and diplomatic silences that might mean everything or nothing. But the pattern is stark enough that analysts across Washington, Ottawa, and London are watching closely. Within 72 hours of the meeting, Trump ordered the Department of Defense to conduct a comprehensive review of NATO commitments with specific focus on asymmetric burden sharing in North American defense. The language was bureaucratic. The target was obvious. Canada spends roughly 1.3% of GDP on defense, below NATO's 2% guideline, and Trump has long used this as ammunition. But the timing raised eyebrows. This wasn't part of any scheduled policy rollout. It landed like a shot across the bow. Simultaneously, Canadian pension funds, which collectively manage over $1 trillion in assets, began what financial observers describe as a quiet pivot. Three major funds started reducing exposure to American infrastructure projects, particularly those in energy and transportation. The moves were technically justified as portfolio rebalancing, standard risk management, but the coordination was unusual. These weren't panic sells. They were strategic withdrawals, the kind you make when you're preparing for a longer conflict. Then came the intelligence freeze. 5 officials across 2 governments have confirmed, on condition of anonymity, that regular intelligence sharing protocols between Canadian and American security agencies experienced unexplained delays starting in mid-January 2025. Routine briefings were postponed. Scheduled working group meetings were quietly canceled. Nothing stopped entirely, which would have triggered alarm bells, but the tempo changed enough that people noticed. One former CIA analyst described it as the professional equivalent of going from texting back immediately to leaving someone on red. The public wouldn't know any of this except for one detail. Someone leaked. A partial transcript of the Carney-Trump meeting appeared in a Toronto-based outlet known for connections to Liberal Party operatives. It contained enough specific dialogue to be credible, not enough to be verifiable, and just the right amount of dramatic tension to go viral. Within hours, the clip of Carney saying "enough is enough" was being shared across social media, framed as a David versus Goliath moment. The polite Canadian finally standing up to the bully. Conservative critics called it a reckless provocation. Progressive supporters called it overdue courage. But everyone agreed it was deliberate. Because here's what makes this more than political theater. Carney isn't prime minister yet. He's not even Liberal Party leader yet. He's a candidate. And he just positioned himself as the man willing to confront American power, while his opponent, the sitting leadership, is trying to maintain diplomatic calm. It's a calculated gamble. If tensions escalate and Canada suffers economically, Carney looks reckless. If tensions escalate and Canada holds its ground, he looks like the leader Canada needs. The entire strategy depends on Trump's next move. Trump, for his part, has remained publicly quiet about the meeting, which is itself unusual. He's tweeted about Canadian trade policies before, usually with sharp language about unfair deals and border security. But on Carney specifically, silence. That silence is being interpreted in 2 contradictory ways. Some analysts believe Trump is ignoring Carney, treating him as irrelevant until he actually holds power. Others believe Trump is calculating, waiting to see if Carney wins leadership before deciding whether to treat him as a serious adversary or a useful foil. The strategic implications are layered. Canada is America's 2nd largest trading partner with over $750 billion in bilateral trade annually. Canadian energy exports, particularly oil from Alberta, are critical to American energy security. The shared border is the longest undefended frontier in the world, a point of pride and a strategic vulnerability. Any serious rupture in the relationship doesn't just hurt both economies, it creates openings for other actors. China has already increased investment in Canadian resource projects over the past decade. European allies are watching to see if America's reliable partner framework still means anything. But there's a deeper current here, one that goes beyond economics and geopolitics into something more personal and more dangerous. Trump operates on loyalty and dominance. He values relationships where power dynamics are clear, where respect is demonstrated through deference. Carney operates on rules and institutions, on the idea that partnerships are maintained through mutual benefit and shared values. These are incompatible worldviews, and when they collide at the level of national leadership, the consequences radiate outward. Consider the scenarios. If Carney becomes prime minister and Trump is still in office, we're looking at a relationship defined by tension from day one. Trade negotiations become hostage situations. Defense cooperation becomes transactional. Intelligence sharing becomes conditional. Every disagreement escalates because neither man is inclined to back down. The probability of a serious trade conflict within the first year would be, by analyst estimates, above 60%. The probability of defense funding becoming a public wedge issue, forcing Canada to either dramatically increase military spending or face American pressure campaigns, approaches 75%. Alternatively, if Carney loses the leadership race or the general election, Trump claims a symbolic victory. The man who challenged him failed to gain power, which reinforces Trump's narrative about strength and winning. But that doesn't resolve the underlying tension. Whoever leads Canada next will inherit the same structural problems: an economy deeply integrated with a volatile American partner, a defense posture dependent on American capabilities, and a political environment where anti-American sentiment can be electorally profitable. And here's what keeps strategists up at night. This is happening while global alliances are already strained, while economic nationalism is rising across developed democracies, while the old assumptions about how allied nations treat each other are being systematically tested. Canada isn't some distant partner, it's the neighbor. If the relationship with Canada becomes openly adversarial, it signals to every other American ally that proximity and history mean less than they used to, that the friendship can be weaponized, that loyalty is no longer mutual. The evidence is accumulating in real time. Financial disclosures show that Canadian government officials have begun scenario planning for non-standard trade environments, bureaucratic language for economic warfare. Defense analysts have noted increased Canadian interest in European defense partnerships, a subtle hedge against American unreliability. Polling shows that Canadian public opinion on the United States has dropped to levels not seen since the Iraq War, with particular animosity toward Trump personally. These aren't abstract trends. They're the building blocks of a fundamental realignment. But let's be clear about what this isn't. This isn't Canada suddenly becoming an adversary. This isn't about rejecting the alliance or abandoning cooperation. This is about leverage. Carney's message, the one that went viral, the one that sources say left Trump visibly irritated, was about resetting the terms. Canada can't match American military power. It can't match American economic scale. But it can make itself more expensive to alienate. It can signal that the cost of taking Canada for granted has gone up. It can remind Washington that partnership is a choice, not an obligation. The moral dimension here cuts deeper than policy. There's a betrayal embedded in how Trump has treated Canada, not in any single action, but in the accumulated weight of dismissiveness, the casual threats, the willingness to use a friendship as leverage in unrelated disputes. Canadian soldiers died in Afghanistan fighting a war that America invoked Article 5 to justify. Canadian nurses and doctors helped during Hurricane Katrina. Canadian resources kept American factories running during supply chain crises. And the response has been tariffs, insults, and being lumped in with adversaries during trade negotiations. Carney's "enough is enough" wasn't policy analysis. It was moral accounting. And that's what made it resonate, because it named something that had been building for years but never quite articulated. The sense that being America's closest ally had become a one-way relationship, that proximity had made Canada vulnerable rather than valued, that the rules-based order everyone claimed to support only applied when it was convenient for Washington. Trump's silence since the meeting is its own form of response. He's not engaging because engaging would validate Carney's standing. He's waiting to see if Carney actually gains power, if this is a real challenge or just rhetorical posturing from someone who might never have the authority to follow through. But that silence is also calculation. Every day that passes without American retaliation makes Carney look stronger domestically. Every day that passes without Trump dismissing him entirely gives Carney's challenge legitimacy. The viral moment, the clip spreading across social media, has already changed the landscape. Carney is no longer just the technocratic banker running for leadership. He's the guy who told Trump enough. That's political gold in Canada right now. It's also a trap. Because if he wins and then has to negotiate with Trump, he's starting from a position of public confrontation. He can't back down without looking weak. Trump can't accommodate him without looking weak. The relationship starts adversarial and has nowhere to de-escalate to. Which brings us to the question nobody wants to ask, but everyone is thinking, what if this is the new normal? What if the decades of easy cooperation between Canada and the United States, the undefended border, the integrated supply chains, the automatic assumption of aligned interests, what if all of that was a historical anomaly tied to a specific moment that's now ending? What if Carney and Trump are just the opening act of a much longer recalibration, one that will outlast both of them? The answers matter for more than Canada and America. They matter for every allied nation watching this play out, wondering if their relationships are equally fragile, if their investments in partnership will be honored, if the architecture of Western cooperation can survive contact with nationalist politics. Because if the closest ally can be treated this casually, if even Canada has to say enough is enough, then everyone is vulnerable. What happened after Carney's rebuke went viral is still unfolding. The market shifts are measurable. The diplomatic frost is documented. The political impact is undeniable. But the full consequences won't be clear for months, maybe years. We're watching a friendship stress tested in real time, two visions of partnership colliding, and the outcome will shape more than trade agreements or defense budgets. It will shape how nations trust each other, how alliances function under pressure, how much weight historical ties actually carry when power dynamics shift. So here's where we are. A man who might become Canada's next leader has publicly confronted the American president. The fallout is spreading through diplomatic and economic channels in ways that are visible if you know where to look. And the next moves will determine whether this was a necessary correction or the beginning of something much more fractured. Trump can escalate or ignore. Carney can win or lose. But the conversation has changed. The assumptions have been challenged. And enough is enough has become more than a quote. It's become a question both countries now have to answer.